Finally, under the subject of the diaspora and its purpose of Israel being a seed sown. Everybody's reading their books now while I'm teaching. Doesn't offend me at all, though. Go right ahead. Our study of proselytism takes us into the New Testament documents themselves. We'll continue to talk about the subject of proselytism, but whenever we started on the purpose of Israel as being a seed sown in the world for a great future harvest, we said there'd be two aspects to that, proselytism and the New Testament. But they're really the same, because in the New Testament we're still going to be talking about proselytism. What will make the difference is the material that we will use. The material from here on out being not all those technical things we had to look at with the rabbis. We've given you lots of quotations from Josephus and from the Talmud and things like that. From here on out, we'll be concentrating on the New Testament documents themselves. So that's why I've made this distinction between proselytism and New Testament. They're really the same. Remember that. We're still talking about proselytism. We'll continue to for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, somewhere around there, that many more times it looks like. We'll still be talking about proselytism. Here it's going to be very interesting because it will acquaint you with the 4 New Testament passages we've already given you before, where proselytos or proselutoi, the plural, appears in the New Testament. That's a technical term, but it does actually appear in the New Testament Greek. And not only will you be acquainted with those 4 specific places, but it's going to take us into a much deeper detail into the book of Acts that I don't think that you could really put together without some knowledge, without a lot of background knowledge of who are the proselutoi and where do they stand with regard to the Jewish faith. And therefore, where does all of that stand, the proselutoi and the Jewish faith, with regard to the great, tremendous, unprecedented spread of early Christianity in the book of Acts. So I may not be jumping over chairs right now, but I'm extremely excited about what we're going to be looking at, because it proves some interesting things as far as I'm concerned. It really shapes your interpretation of things like the purpose of Luke and his narrative in Acts. It's one thing to do, as we've done before, and kind of just go through the book and familiarize yourself with the basic events that have taken place. You know, who did what, and where is Paul or Saul brought into the picture, and how many trips did he make, and where did he go, and that's generally as far as anyone really ever gets in Bible study. But that's a dangerous place to be in Bible study, because that's just the place of proof texting. You know a lot of the basics, the surface, what happened, but it'd be very difficult to say, now why did Luke take all the time to tell us such and such? Just 2 examples come to mind right now. Why did he give us word for word, it looks like, Stephen's sermon in Acts 7? I mean, you wasted 60 verses. That's the longest chapter in Acts. Of course, I shouldn't use the term wasted, but you know what I mean. Wasted 60 verses just giving us a sermon. What was so important about that? What was so important about Cornelius' conversion to give us all of that long 10th chapter, that's 48 verses, and half of the 11th chapter, the first 18 verses, not only giving it to us, but it's so monotonous it almost puts you to sleep. You ever read the story of Cornelius? And then what does Paul have to do at Jerusalem in Acts 11? He goes back and says, now, so many days ago I was hungry up on a roof. We already read all about that back in the earlier chapter. And then this vision came, and then after the vision these men came, and I went to Cornelius, and Cornelius said this to me. Well, we already have all of that in chapter 10. See, it's one thing to know the history that someone's writing. Luke is trying to give us several decades of church history. And you know how long it takes modern scholars to write about several decades of church history. Volumes and volumes and volumes. Because what they're trying to do is give you every single thing that happened. Well, so is Luke. But he's doing it with the power of the Holy Spirit. And so he can give us illustrations. He can lift examples out. And if we can read into it, what is Luke talking about here? And we're going to really get into this in Acts chapter 6 in this discussion between the Grecians and the Hebrews there. What type of discussion, what type of problem was this? The daily ministration that their widows were being neglected. What is that about? Why go into all of that history? Well, it's very interesting, and it's very instructive. It's very helpful in our reconstruction of the history of the early church. It's just amazing what you can know whenever you go beyond just, you can quote this verse or that verse, and you got to start there. You have to be able to start knowing, what is Acts about? Give me some events of chapter 1 to chapter 13 to chapter 28. Hopefully you could do that. But that's only a starting point. Those are building blocks. Those are pegs that we're going to hang other ideas and reconstructions upon. It just so happens that the New Testament documents themselves are our best sources for first century Jewish proselytism. Because of, do you remember the because of? It just so happens that the New Testament documents are our best sources. We have, I'll give you a little hint by the next sentence, we have a lot of information. The Talmud has given us a lot of information that we've tried to build a lot on and reconstruct and tie together before. Well, as I've said earlier, the mistake is often made of erroneously reading the rather late Talmudic accounts back into the early history of the first century. And that's a mistake that's commonly made by people. In other words, the Talmud is giving us a lot of proselytism facts, but are they facts that are relevant for the 4th century A.D., which is when Tiberian and Babylonian Talmuds are being written, or relevant to the 1st century A.D., the time of the spread of early Christianity? Sometimes it's impossible to tell. Oftentimes what they have done is they have taken contemporary events that were current in the days of the writing of the Talmud, and then tried to draw from that or superimpose that back on the 1st century record or the 1st century lack of a record. So we're not just totally at the mercy of rather late Jewish sources, is what I'm trying to say, in reconstructing the proselytism situation of the 1st century A.D. For, in fact, we do have the New Testament documents, and we know they're reliable. That's one thing that's good about studying any aspect of history whenever the Bible touches on that history. Rabbis, it's not inspired. The Talmud's not inspired. They've got some facts in there, and I'm sure there are manifold legends in there as well. And even their facts, do they interpret their facts correctly? We just were talking about that a moment ago. The New Testament, as well as the Old Testament authors, certainly do. They provide us with reliable facts, and they can interpret those facts correctly. So it's of great relief and comfort that we have the New Testament documents to give us a little insight into the subject of proselytism. Now, the places where we're going to find the term predominantly, of course, is the book of Acts. That's what we'll be getting to. So tonight, we'll start with the one other place where we find it, and that is in Matthew chapter 23. We don't find a whole lot in this passage about proselytism as it's discussed, really anywhere else, especially A, in our earlier studies, and B, in the book of Acts. And that is because it concerns a very specific and very, very narrow type of proselytism here. Now, we've got many different questions we want to try to answer. And we've got many texts to study. Not all of these can be answered from Matthew 23. Not all of them can be answered just from the Acts 2, 6, and 13 passages where we find proselutoi or proselutos again. But we do want to look at the terms proselutos and proselutoi here. We do want to know who the Sybalmenoi and Phalbumenoi are, according to Luke in the book of Acts, and you'll become familiar with those Greek terms later on, the Sybalmenoi and the Phalbumenoi. Those are some important people in Acts, very important. Luke has a lot to say about them, and sometimes they're found in the context of the proselutoi. And so what's the relationship? That's probably the chief question. What's the relationship between the Sybalmenoi and the Phalbumenoi and the proselutoi? He's using those terms, those whatever or whomever they represent are popping up time and time again, and what's he trying to tell us in that narrative? Why do we have the variation in terminology? There seem to be some connections, but connections as far as synonyms are concerned doesn't seem to be the case, or why the different words. Why not just stay with one term like proselutoi or sibumenoi or phobumenoi? And Luke does change about halfway through his book. Well, let's start in Matthew 23 and verse 15. The first time in the New Testament where the term proselutoi or proselutos appears. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye come to sea and land to make one proselyte, one proselutos. And when he is made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. Now, this is the verse we want to start discussing tonight. We're going to break it up and look at it piece by piece. But before getting to that, let me just remind you of a few things in review. In starting with Matthew 23, we're going to be addressing ourselves to the subject of full proselytes, or as you know them now more technically, although it's anachronistic, proselytes of righteousness versus proselytes of the gate. Now, from our study thus far, we know that proselutos always and can only mean a Gentile converted to Judaism through basically the three steps of circumcision, baptism, and sacrifice. Thus, full proselyte, or proselyte of righteousness versus proselyte of the gate, is really a little tautological. We're simply repeating what is the obvious because there is no other proselyte but a proselyte. But that is only as they are used strictly technically. As we have seen in the later writings, oftentimes the group is broken up so that we speak of proselytes of righteousness and proselytes of the gate. But if you don't go through circumcision, you haven't converted to Judaism. So to call him a proselyte of the gate is really nonsense. You can't be a proselyte unless you're a full one, and that's the only kind that there is, a proselyte. You're either a proselyte or you're not. So we're going to be looking at, in quotation marks, full proselytes. Proselytes of righteousness, first of all. And we're going to keep using that term because that's a current term, it's a popular term, it's been that way for years and years in Christian study and in Jewish study as well. But just to remind you of the fact that you either were a proselyte or you were not. There's no such thing as a partial proselyte. You couldn't get partially circumcised or partially baptized or couldn't offer a partial sacrifice. You either did it or you didn't. You identified or you didn't. But we do have those who were sympathizers. We do have those proselytes of the gate, and they were called that because they kind of stopped right there. They came in out of the world, but they didn't go into the city. They didn't go into the camp of Israel. They kind of stopped at the gate. They were sympathizers. They were very interested in Judaism. They thought that Judaism had a lot to offer. Obviously, or they never would have turned their back on heathenism or pure paganism. They thought a lot about Judaism, but they were not ready to go all the way through with those final steps for whatever reasons, probably the most basic of those being the social stigma attached to a Gentile who converted to this nasty race of dogs known as the Jews. Later in our study, once, in other words, we get through with the four terms, the four places where the term proselutos appears, we'll be talking about those proselytes of the gate then. You see, if we're going to look at four places in the New Testament where proselutos occurs, then it has to be speaking of a proselyte in the full sense of the term. Otherwise, it wouldn't use that term. That is a strictly technical term that is found only in regard to Gentiles who convert all the way to Judaism. That's where sibomenoi and phobumenoi will come in later. Luke has some other terminology and other besides that to speak of other groups of people. Some of them fringe groups, Jewish fringe groups, Gentile fringe groups, and the like. The later rabbis did use the term proselyte of righteousness and proselyte of the gate, so although it's anachronistic, it's also, as Lightfoot said, very convenient. The New Testament, if you haven't gotten this from what I've just sermonized you on already, always uses the technically correct terms. We would expect it to. The Jewish writings do at this time as well. The Talmud doesn't because it's much later, uses later terminology and reads it back into the first century. And this is way, way off the subject. It is interesting, however, though, that since the New Testament does use the correct terminology, we know to be correct from this day and time, it would seem to have to prove that all of the critical notions for the date of the New Testament books are simply way off base. They like to date the New Testament books way up into the 2nd and 3rd century A.D. Well, that'd be impossible, because those authors then, if they were writing that late, would be using terminology similar to the Jews writing the Talmud. They never would have known which terms were the exactly technical and proper ones to use at this day and time. So it's going to use it 4 times, and when it uses proselytos or proselytoi, it's technically and precisely correct. Matthew 23:15. My next note says CEH tape number 56. That was Errors and Heresies number 56. Of course, you don't have to see it, because I'll tell you a little about it right now. That was taught December the 28th, 1984. Just about 3 years ago, we gave you a brief discussion of this verse, when we looked at 7 woes that Jesus gives to the leaders of Israel that we applied to the leaders of the church. Religious minds are always basically the same, rather monotonous and unchanging. Now, on that tape, I even mention proselytes of righteousness in the gate. Of course, it wouldn't have meant anything to you then, I'm sure. But I also mention on that tape, I've obviously heard it to make sure I said what I think I said. I also said on that tape that at that time I didn't want to get into the technicalities, and you were grateful back then that I didn't. But we are now. We already have. You're familiar with all the technicalities by now. So we're beyond most of the technical, rabbinical Jewish technicalities. Now, it is verse 15, the second of 7 woes that Jesus gives the Pharisees and the scribes. The first one is given in verse 13. Verse 14, if you have your KJV with you, is textually corrupt. And your NIV, I'm sure, will omit verse 14 or have something to say about it. But we should go from 13 to 15 in Matthew 23. We've got woe 1 in 13, no woes in 14. There's not a 14, and woe 2 in 15. So here we've got in verse 15 the second of 7 woes that he gives to the Pharisees and the scribes, and it concerns, of all things, their activity in proselytizing. Now it follows the first woe, which speaks of closing the kingdom's door. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. And I think we used some of the last verses in Luke 11 to show you what he meant by closing up the door. And he talks about, I believe, the keys over there in the end of Luke 11. For ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for ye neither go in yourselves, neither suffer ye them that are entering to go in. Now, I know people today tell us it's not proper to tell someone that they're not saved and that those that they're witnessing to are not saved, but Jesus did it, though. It's this old weak marshmallow cup of tea type of Christianity today won't let us say what the truth is about so many things. But he pointed to them and said, you're not going to the kingdom of heaven. You're blocking the door, and all of your converts, they're not going into the kingdom either. In other words, he's saying you're all damned. And if he goes on to call the proselytoi twofold more the huios of Gehenna, of hell, the children or sons of Gehenna, if they're twofold, that means the Pharisees are at least onefold children of Satan. They're going to hell. So he said it. So the Pharisees close the entrance to life, and then, of all things, try and win converts to this cul-de-sac way. I mean, they are closing the door, they're not going anywhere, and they're winning converts to a dead-end road, in other words. Well, it's not dead-end, it goes somewhere, but it certainly doesn't lead into life. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Now, when he mentions scribes and Pharisees, he's including all of the Jewish leaders. But as we so often see, the Pharisees are the group whom he confronts most often. They are the ones most often seen in the Gospels, the Pharisees. and the scribes and the Sadducees and the lawyers and the doctors, and we'll get into those terms later here in ITP. Those appear somewhere else down the ladder. The Pharisees, that's the major group with whom he has to do. And he uses that, it's a dreadful word, and the Pharisees knew what he meant by this term, hypocrite. It comes from a Greek term that speaks of those who wear a mask or who wear a costume and who simply get up on the stage and fulfill a role, but are totally detached from that. You're not the person that you're pretending that you are up there. And so it's passed down now into popular language, a hypocrite. If you call someone a role player, that kind of blunts the meaning. It doesn't have nearly the sharp edge that hypocrite does, but they mean exactly the same thing. A role player is one who plays a role, but they don't live it. But hypocrite's a dreadful, dreadful term. And in castigating them, probably this is the worst thing he could think of, to call them a hypocrite. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Let's start with this first phrase now. For ye compass sea and land. We'll stop there. For ye compass sea and land. The word compass is a broad word that means essentially what you have there. It speaks of a circle. He's not criticizing them for going around in a circle, but he's speaking of their great endeavors. You compass sea and land. You're going everywhere. It's like around the globe. Of course, literally, surely that wasn't true, but it's as though you're going around the globe. You travel sea and land. Now, the NIV reverses the order that we have in the KJV and speaks of land and sea. You compass land and sea instead of sea and land. So, what saith the Greek? Well, the Greek has the KJV order of sea and land. And that's really the way that we should keep it for a very obvious reason. I'll share with you here in a moment. Well, why does the NIV reverse it? Well, it's certainly not one of those great, monumental, heretical situations here. It's not going to matter in the final analysis how you have it, sea and land or land and sea. But what do we say in contemporary English? We never say sea and land. We say they compass land and sea. They go over land and sea. We never say sea and land. We always put land first and then follow it by sea. And so the NIV wants to stay current with contemporary English idiom. It's a proverbial expression. We so use it today, of course, much like the expression, they leave no stone unturned, another metaphorical proverbial expression that we use today. So this business of compassing sea and land, or compassing land and sea, is not an English idiom. It's not a proverbial expression that owes its origin to the English language, but it actually goes way back into Greek times. A proverbial expression, much like they leave no stone unturned, to speak of their great zeal and missionary activity. But I think that the KJVs, following the Greeks, sea and land, would better fit the context, because he is addressing himself to the Jews. He is addressing himself to the Jews in Palestine, more specifically the Jews in Jerusalem. And Israel, being such a narrow strip of land as it is, and yet situate right on the border of the Mediterranean Sea, would first, before reaching land to proselytize, have to travel across the Mediterranean. And that's generally the direction in which they went. So if you have a picture of a map of Israel in the Mediterranean Sea in your mind, then I think you can understand why we should best leave this compass sea and land. I guess maybe if you live in the heartland of the USA, like, Missouri or Arkansas, you'd want to say land and sea. There aren't any seas around. You don't want to say land and sea. You got to go over a lot of land to get to your nearest sea or ocean to travel on. But for Israel, it's just the reverse. You live a couple of miles from the sea. So it'd be sea and land. You compass sea and land. First, you get in your boats down at Joppa or down at Ascalon or down at Gaza. You get in your boats, first of all, at sea, and you travel all over the sea to get to Spain or to get to Italy or Asia, or to get to Greece, or to get to North Africa, or one of the islands like Cyprus, or Samothrace, or Samos, or Cnidus, or wherever, and then once you're on land, you do your proselytizing activity there. The Wycliffe Nicholas Bible gives us, that's lit tape 147, gives us sea and land, and the KJV probably took their cue from that. Although they could have gotten it from the Greek, but the Wycliffe Nicholas Bible, lit tape 147, gives us that, and that's probably what the KJV translators went by. So, he's certainly speaking of some rather extensive, rather zealous, proselytizing missionary activity, not of the Jewish people per se, but of one segment of them, of the Pharisees. Pharisees and scribes, but the scribes, you see, could be a Pharisee. They'd still be a part of the same religious party. The evidence of the first century of such activity by the Pharisees, I think, substantiates this criticism by Christ. It's going to end up as a criticism. We could take it just thus far as a bare statement of fact. There is other evidence in the first century that would tend to support or substantiate this. And the reason I say that is because a lot of ink has been spilled over this verse in scholars' writings and saying, well, I don't know that the Pharisees ever were involved in proselytizing activity. I don't know if you've ever come across that notion, but I know that I have. And so you've got different views on that. In other words, whether or not Jesus knew what he was talking about. Or to say it another way, if they don't want it to be so strongly, that almost seems to say they're denying the inspiration of Scripture or something. Is he just accommodating himself to a popular metaphor where all the people would still nevertheless understand that such was not really or truly the case? I think the evidence points to the fact that it is really and truly the case, that they were involved in proselytizing activity, strange as that may seem. Now you think about that for a moment, that does appear to be very strange. The Pharisees are a legalistic, rigid group, and they can't seem to stand anyone around them who doesn't follow all of their Pharisaical minutiae. I mean, they can't even get along with their brethren Sadducees. They're all Jews. Can't even get along with fellow Jews. And they killed Jesus. They can't get along with him. They can't get along with the apostles. They can't get along with, if you read over in John 7, the common Jewish man who's ignorant of Old Testament Scripture and prophecy. Remember, the people are confused. Even some of the people that the Pharisees had sent to take Jesus, they're confused whenever they heard him speak. Oh, they said, never a man has spoken like this before. Pharisees retort, are you also deceived by this madman? So the people are ignorant. They don't know the Scriptures. You're ignorant whenever you listen to a man and you come close to being deceived by him. So with all of that being true, and all of that's true from the New Testament, well, it's nothing short of almost the miraculous that the Pharisees, of all people, the Pharisees, are involved in proselytizing raw pagan Gentiles. They can't even win fellow Jews to their position. Whenever Paul's called on the carpet in Acts 23, the way he gets out of it, he says, oh, I'm called here for the hope of the resurrection. Because he knew the council was split between Sadducees and Pharisees, and that threw them into a fight, and in essence, he walked out the back door. Why can't the Pharisees even get together with their own fellow Jews? Well, it's impossible. So, maybe the thought is something like this. That sounds nearly miraculous, but hold on, we'll go a step further here. The Jews have a lot of other groups competing for their adherents, religious splinter sects and segments of Judaism. And those Gentiles out there, they haven't heard all of these notions of this rabbi and that rabbi, and so the Pharisees could just go up on them as though they're presenting an entirely, well, to them it would be an entirely new religion or new philosophy that has their full support, the people's full support, God's full support. It's got ancient history behind it. It's got ancient records behind it, the documents of Moses that go way back 1,500 years before then, assuming they believe that he wrote the Pentateuch, and they weren't as ignorant as critical scholars are today. They knew that he had written the Pentateuch. They've got all of that to support their view then. Well, then maybe the Gentiles would have had something to listen to then. You say, but who would ever have been won to the minutiae of a Pharisaic interpretation. Well, that's very appealing to a lot of people. Why do some people get in various rigid cults today? But just kind of the lackadaisical, don't rock the boat attitude of all big institutional religion is, terrible to them in their eyes. It's not appealing to them at all. They want something where commitment is involved. They want something where there are laws to do and books to read and founders and leaders to whom you must bow down and worship and flowers to sell and money to collect and garments to make. And, oh, that's fun. You get involved in life. You get to do things in. That's different than institutional religion. Well, some of the Gentiles could have thought the same thing. They could have gone through the racket of, like the Eleusinian mysteries of the women grabbing animals in the dead of night and ripping their limbs apart and drinking their blood and eating their heart. That gets old after a while. You say, surely there's more to the religious existence than this.
The continuation of this message.
Like the Eleusinian mysteries of the women grabbing animals in the dead of night and ripping their limbs apart and drinking their blood and eating their heart. That gets old after a while. You say, surely there's more to the religious existence than this. And the Jews, what did they offer? A very high moral, spiritual ethic. We've seen before from the writings of Josephus, that's the thing that attracted them. He said, we didn't offer them any sensual bait. He said it was the pure, high ethic and spirituality and morals of the law. The law inherently has won converts to itself without extending some sensual bait that all of the other false religions had to. So, in other words, what I'm saying is I'm trying to argue both sides of the position here. On one side we could see, well, the Pharisees would never win a convert. Why go to the trouble? On the other side, well, maybe they would win some converts. And a second point on this other side, Ron, they wouldn't keep on compassing sea and land if they're not effective or successful. You give up after a while. Well, I take that back. Institutional religion today never gives up. They keep pouring money down the bottomless pit of missions overseas, and they might win a couple of dubious converts, and they're dubious at that in 10 years on the mission field. But people of that day were better thinkers than people are today. So you're not going to keep going over sea and land or land and sea trying to win converts where you're not winning any. You give up after a while. I would argue, in other words, that the Pharisees were successful. All right, let's go on to a second point here. You compass sea and land to make one. Have to break it up to study it, but keep the whole verse in mind as we look at it. To make one. One what? One proselyte. We'll get to that in a moment. To make one. Now, there are different proposals as to what one emphasizes when you read the commentators. There are different proposals as to what one emphasizes. Here's one proposal. Perhaps a particularly well-known episode of some illustrious figure being one to Judaism, perhaps one high up in Roman government, for example, is behind this emphasis on one. The Jewish Encyclopedia, in volume 10, page 221, interprets this idea more or less and gives an example. But it is anachronistic, so it couldn't be the one that Jesus has reference to here. Jewish Encyclopedia, volume 10, page 221. In other words, when he says, you compass sea and land to make one, well, the one is one well-known, illustrious figure that stands out in memory. Maybe it was, let's say, 20 years prior to the time of this, but it has stood out in memory ever since then. And maybe that gave the Pharisees the impetus they needed to keep on going for the next 2 decades. And if it's an illustrious figure, maybe it was someone way high up in Roman government. And so what he's saying is you compass sea and land, to make one, with the emphasis on you've only made one this particular one, this illustrious, well-known figure, and just as a good for instance, or for example, a governmental official who is rather high up in Roman affairs. Another proposal would emphasize, again, one, to mean what you might have thought of when you first read it, meager, insubstantial results. So that's a good proposal. By the way, I don't accept the first proposal. It just doesn't make any, well, it makes somewhat of sense, but we don't have any evidence of that, and it's the least likely of the proposals that you'll come across. Now, if you were reading along and you saw this, for ye compass sea and land, and so you kind of picture in your mind blood, sweat, and tears, ye compass sea and land, to make one, then don't you almost see the ironic contrast, large investment, small return? That's one thing, of course, the money managers don't want you to ever do. Large investment, small return means fire your money manager, or means he'll never get a license to manage anybody. Large investment, small return, that's not smart. Is that the ironic contrast? Is that the biting thought of what he's critical of here? You compass sea and land, large investment. That means you have to have boats. That means you've got to take off from work. That means you've got to have supplies. That means you have to leave your families. Large investment. To make one. He didn't say to make proselytes. Then there wouldn't be that, couldn't even think of that contrast. But to make one singular proselytos. To make one. So large investment, small return here. You're not getting anything out of it. And that is what is so absolutely foolish or ironic or stupid about what you're doing. Well, about this proposal, I would say that it's probably true that the returns were relatively small. Notice that conversion is not to Mosaicism. Conversion is not to Judaism. Conversion is only to one small, sectarian, specific segment of all of this, Pharisaicism. Just to the Pharisaic way of thinking and believing. In other words, think of it like this. Although the numbers might be large in some of these examples that I'm going to give you here in just a moment, proportionally speaking, the number of Gentiles in the Roman world who are interested in Judaism is very small. The number of those interested who are willing to go through circumcision, baptism, and sacrifice is yet smaller. The number of those interested who go through those three steps and go all the way into the Pharisaic minutiae would be yet smaller. So surely that was true. Whether that's what he's saying here, we'll get to in a moment. But surely the fact that they did give large investment and they reaped small returns, surely that has to be true. Just common sense would tell you that. Small number, now I've told you before they were very successful in proselytizing work. But we're saying proportionally speaking tonight. As far as the number of Gentiles out there, just a handful are ever interested in Judaism. Just a handful of that handful will go all the way to become a proselyte of righteousness. And just a handful of the handful of the handful would ever go all the way through to become a Pharisee. That'd be a very small percentage. Give me an example in the New Testament of a Gentile who becomes a Pharisee. We just can't find examples of that. That's why some scholars have said Jesus totally missed it here. This is an historical inaccuracy here. Because we just can't fathom a Gentile ever converting through, being interested to being a proselyte to being a Pharisee, and neither can we fathom a Pharisee ever allowing a pure pagan, raw Gentile ever to become a fellow Pharisee, as proud as the Pharisees were. So it's a verse we might easily read over and not recognize some of the inherent problems in it, what the scholars like to do with a verse like this. Well, there are two proposals. Then there is a third proposal. And that would say that the thrust of the rebuke, as we get to the conclusion of it, which we haven't done yet, seems more directed toward the conclusion of proselytism by the Pharisees, rather than the meager, insubstantial results. You think of another way to describe this or explain this. I said that the thrust of the rebuke seems directed toward the conclusion of proselytism by the Pharisees, the conclusion in this verse that Jesus draws from their zealous missionary activity, rather than just the lack of results as far as numbers are concerned. I think they had to be somewhat successful enough in their own mind to keep them happy and content enough to continue to compass sea and land to make one more proselyte. There had to be at least that much success involved. Number-wise, I'm sure it had to be small, people who would go all the way over into the Pharisaic thought. But I think that probably what we have here, whenever he underscores to make one proselyte, emphasizing one, is the irony of the result of one's conversion to the Pharisaic way. In other words, it would be something like this. Rather than large investment, small return, it would be you go to great length to convert a man only to his ruin. That, I think, is what probably is more underscored here with the term one. You go to great length to convert a man only to ruin him. Now you have to read the rest of the verse to really end up with that conclusion. In other words, again, to say it a different way, the thought would be this. You go to such great lengths to make one man, and then you make him to his own ruin. I mean, that's the whole ironic thing about it. Missionary activity is fine as long as you have something worthwhile to which people can be won. I mean, we're certainly called to be missionaries and to go out and to spread the news. It's because we have something worth winning people to. But if you don't have that and you go out and make converts, how ironic. I mean, the whole irony is what you have is absolutely worthless. It'll lead you nowhere but to damnation and hell. So why don't you just keep it to yourself? Why don't you just let your own soul be damned and leave the rest of the world alone? See, I think the irony is more biting whenever we interpret it that way. And I know that's the way we should interpret it, because he goes on to draw that point out here at the end. You make him twofold more the child of hell than you are yourselves. Right. Somehow that has to be brought into or drawn into our interpretation of what he means by making one. That's the irony of it all. The Pharisees would have caught that immediately. Scholars today, of course, don't catch it, but the Pharisees would have caught that immediately. You hear what he's saying to us. I mean, it's one thing we would all admit whenever you're criticized that you don't win many converts. That's kind of depressing, and that's one thing. But whenever they go beyond that, they're not just criticizing you for your lack of results, but it is your results they're criticizing. The results. What are the results? You're winning a man to his own damnation. In other words, what he's trying to say to the Pharisees, we already saw in the earlier woe there. What happens? You close the door to the kingdom and won't let anyone else in. And so this second woe is similar to that. It goes beyond that. It builds on that, but it's similar to that. You close the door. Why don't you just keep the door closed on yourself and leave the rest of the world alone? Leave everybody else alone. We had a carload of Jehovah's Witnesses come to our house again this week. Those are the most blasphemous, buzzing mosquitoes around. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know anything. And they won't listen to logic. They won't listen to reason. You can't argue with them. You can't talk to them. And my wife, I was discussing and tricking them and trying to get into some theology with them, and she finally came to the door. She talked to them first. They wanted to sell her a book on creation versus evolution. Well, we got, 50 60, 70 tapes on that, so I don't think we need to buy a little $2 cheap book. But they just use that to get their foot in the door. And then they want to sell you a book on the true name of God in the Old Testament. And I already had that from the last time I talked to two men who came over, and so we don't want to go through that again. So, but anyway, I came up, and then I'm talking, and she finally comes back and says, why don't you get your old trashy selves out of here? Quit going around to people's house. They don't want you old trashy people knocking on doors and bothering people and trying to convert them to your old trashy false ways. I thought, how appropriate. No one asked them to come over. I mean, if you want to believe that doctrine, you can go to a kingdom hall, or you can pick up some literature or something. You know, there ought to be a law against that.
That's right.
People coming in, we don't do that to them, knocking on your door and feeding you all this garbage, and you don't want to listen to all of that. Of course, you can close the door on them, but still, they've interrupted your day, though. They come up and say, listen, we want to sell you this. We don't want their baubles and trinkets and gadgets and booklets that they have. The point is, they're not going anywhere but below, and so why don't they just keep all of that nonsense to themselves? It's funny, when people get false doctrine, they become more zealous, it seems like, than those who have the truth for sharing these things. It's the clean-cut, white shirt, black pants Mormon brothers that come around to everybody's house. And the Jehovah's Witnesses that are just going everywhere. And then they shot back to us right away, well, if you say you're a Christian, don't you believe in the Great Commission and going out and witnessing to people? And we said, no, we don't. Well, then they misinterpret that. Well, you don't believe, that means you don't follow Jesus. Well, we don't believe what you believe about what he said. So that doesn't get you anywhere. I just think I didn't come to your house and bother you some morning. But they feel a divine call on their life to share all their trashy bit. There's no hell, then people sleep whenever they die. You know, there's no heaven, there's no hell. People aren't eternally judged. Jesus isn't the Son of God. He's only Michael. They went through the whole thing there. And you just would refute and refute and refute, and they won't listen to a word that you've got to say. They're a good picture of what the Pharisees would be like, who have all of these notions from the rabbis that can't be supported in the law of Moses. All of their can'ts and cans and do's and don'ts. I mean, some of it could, but the vast majority of that couldn't be supported from the law of Moses. Jesus would never have come rebuking them so severely and so sternly. He favored the law of Moses. He's quoting it all the time. He used just Deuteronomy chapter 6 and chapter 8 3 times against Satan in Matthew 4. He believed in the law. He believed in Moses. He believed in what Moses had to say. Not what the Pharisees had to say about what Moses had to say. That's where the problem enters all the time. And the same with Jehovah's Witnesses. We believe what, quote, Jehovah had to say, unquote. But we don't believe what they have to say about what Jehovah had to say. Oh, just like vermin, ants, mosquitoes, bugs, rodents, rats, mice crawling around. Just you want to get a fly swatter out and swat some of them. Just nasty vermin crawling around the earth. They ought to be annihilated. Of course, they won't. They've got a worse punishment awaiting them. And you don't even feel sorry for people like that. They are just deluded. They want to be deluded. They are deluded willingly. I mean, they go through indoctrination into all of that, where this is what you believe. They're told this is what you believe, and they memorize all of that. We never approach matters that way. We want to know what the pros and cons are, what this view is and what that view is, and how all the views stand up. The light of Scripture, and the light of reason, the light of history, the light of, whatever. They won't even listen to that. It's this is the way, this is the only way, and we're not even open to anything else. Well, a person that's as closed-minded as that deserves to be deceived. They deserve that. A person who's got an open mind, who's willing to investigate, well, they don't deserve to be deceived as much as someone like that does, I would surely say. So the biting remark here is you go to great length to convert a man only to ruin him. And that would just ruin the Pharisees' day, I'm sure. Not only is he criticizing perhaps meager results, that would be understandable, but criticizing the conclusion to the results, although they're meager, that they produce. So the contrast is not so much great length, small success, but great length, sorry conclusion. That's what would have disturbed the Pharisees. Not so much great length, small success, but great length, sorry conclusion. And what do they make? Well, our next word, a proselyte. According to our studies, the definition of this term is a technical one, and it's used technically here. This is one who goes through circumcision, baptism, sacrifice. Can't be used any other way. These aren't God-fearers. These aren't people who are sympathetic. These aren't gate or fence riders. These are people who go all the way. But the Pharisees are not winning people to Judaism. They're winning them through Judaism to the Pharisaic way. They are not winning people already Jews to the strictures of the Pharisaic way, but Gentiles to Pharisaism. That's what's remarkable about it all. They're not winning just, first place, people who are already Jews to the party of the Pharisees. That would be perhaps easier than what they're doing here. They're not winning in the second place people who are Gentiles just to Judaism and stopping there. We have something unique, and you won't find this anywhere else in the New Testament. It's the only reference to it. We find them winning pure Gentiles all the way through Judaism to the party of the Pharisees. We are not told, however, I might add at this point, whether or not this includes Gentiles that are already loosely attached to the synagogues, such as proselytes of the gate. This is possible. That we're simply not told. They're pure Gentile. They've not converted. They're not Jews. But do they know anything about Judaism at all? We don't know. That's certainly possible. It would make sense. Here would be a group of people who are already somewhat familiar with the basic tenets of the faith of the Jewish people. They haven't converted to anything, but they're interested. They're sympathetic. But then if just the plain synagogue or plain Judaism hasn't been able to make their mind up to go all the way through, what would it be about the Pharisaic party that's able to convince them? Well, that'd be a question that really we couldn't answer. That'd be very difficult to answer. So we don't know whether these were Gentiles who had no knowledge or no contact of or with Judaism at all, or whether we've got people who are sitting on the steps of the synagogue, listening, not willing to go in, enjoying what they hear, but not willing to go through circumcision. As I say, just to repeat myself, what then would the Pharisees have to offer? What would have been their logic? What argument would they have leveled against these people to convince them to go all the way? Because if you're going to become a Pharisee, you've got to go through circumcision. They weren't willing to earlier, if we're assuming this is a group of people he has under consideration, or at least partly so. Then what type of argument can you think up to make them take that step that earlier they were simply unwilling to take? That we cannot answer. But the fact of the matter is, they were not Jews, these are Gentiles, and the fact of the matter is, they were not just one to Judaism, they were one all the way over to the Pharisaic party. Now, I've still got a little time left this evening, but I'm not going to use it. I'm going to stop there because in the next study that I want to do, I have so much information, I'm sure that it'll take perhaps 1.5, maybe closer to 2 messages to discuss it, so I'll attach the conclusion to what I want to say on Matthew 23:15 to the beginning of that. So we'll end with this result. When he is made, ye make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. We'll leave that with you to think about. How accurate or how fair, as some of the scholars would ask us, is that indictment? Pharisees are pretty bad people. How in the world can you make someone twice as bad as you when you're a Pharisee? Is that really a fair indictment, or is he simply using a figure of speech? Is he simply using hyperbole there? One or the other, or is there a third alternative? Well, we'll look at some of those possibilities then next Friday night.